Welcome to the second segment of the ninth lecture, in which I'm talking about the notion of moral accountability. In this segment, I'm going to talk about a related issue of causal responsibility. Causal responsibility is apparently a scientific issue, but as you'll see, it's not well defined, and if you think of somebody as only being held morally accountable when they're causally responsible for an outcome, then you're going to miss a lot of important elements in your decision. Causal responsibility is important. It's used in two places. It's used in prediction because in making a decision, an agent needs to know what's going to happen. So the agent's going to need to know some notions of what to expect, and that requires judgments of causation. What outcomes will the decision cause? But it's also used sometimes retrospectively. We may need to know about knowledge to assign about causation to assign moral accountability. Now, I stress this may because in some ethical theories, you definitely need to know about causal responsibility in order to assign praise and blame. But in other theories, maybe not so much, and you'll see this in a moment. So there's many theories of nature of causal responsibility. These are theories of the concept of a causation in science. One of them is that causes are sufficient conditions, another is that they're necessary conditions, and a third that we'll talk about is that they're a more restrictive sort of concept, being a ness condition, a necessary element in a set of jointly sufficient conditions. Now, what does all this mean? Well, first of all, something's a sufficient condition if it is enough to produce the outcome by itself. If it's able to, if when the cause is present, the outcome is present, then we can say that the first event, it causes the second event. It may not always be required. Maybe there's other ways of bringing about the outcome. So that, but it's enough. It's sufficient to bring about the cause is a condition that's sufficient to bring about the outcome. It's enough to bring about the outcome. A cause as a necessary condition is a little bit different. Here, it's a sufficient condition is enough. A necessary condition is required for the outcome. Without the condition being in place, the outcome would not have occurred. It may not actually be sufficient by itself to produce the outcome, but it's required. It has to be there in order for the outcome to happen. Okay, you see the difference? Necessary, sufficient, enough, or required. In law, this is often called the but-for clause. But for the cause, the outcome will not happen. And this notion of causal responsibility is sometimes applied in the law. A ness condition is more difficult. You might have a set of jointly sufficient conditions. So you look for there's a bunch of conditions that together are enough to produce the outcome, but maybe not enough by themselves. And if one of the elements in that set of sufficient conditions that are not necessary for it, that are not individually sufficient, individually enough, but are jointly enough, and if you can find a necessary element in that set of sufficient conditions, you can call that the cause. This is getting kind of complicated, but I'll give you some examples. And I'm going to give the examples by giving you problems. So here's a problem with the notion of causation as a sufficient condition. And this is a sort of scenario that holds in business because it's Jack and Jill in the pin factory, specializing and dividing the labor. Here, though, they're producing a product, so they're producing something useful, but at the same time, they're producing pollution. They produce chemical A, which Jack is better at doing, and they produce chemical B, which Jill is better at doing. And when together A and B they mix them together, they get product C, which they can sell, but they also get pollution D, which is this product which is harmful. The threshold of harm in this case, this is just an imaginary model, it can't be taken too seriously, is 20 liters. Now, as before, we have Jack's more productive at producing A, Jill's more productive at producing B. Working alone, they can only produce 9 and 9, which is 18 a day, which is below the threshold, right? The threshold is 20. But working together, they produce, they can produce, Jack can specialize in producing A, Jill can specialize in producing B. They can produce 90 units of the product. They also produce 90 units of the pollution. And 90 is larger than 20, so together they cause harm. Now, the problem here is that neither of these people, neither Jack or Jill, is sufficient, but working alone to produce enough pollution to cross the threshold of harm. Even together, working when they can only produce 9 units each, or even together, if they work alone, they can produce 18. But when they work together, they can cause harm. So neither of them working alone is sufficient to produce to cause the problem. Here's another case where sufficient conditions don't work, and this is another element in business decisions, which is the existence of causal chains. And here's the one we talked about earlier. Here's Amy in the middle of this causal chain that comes from the investors, ... to a disaster. Okay, Amy's decision to recommend to the board that they outsource the contract overseas is an element in this causal chain, but is not sufficient by itself. If any of these others after Amy don't do what change or were not perform as described, then the disaster would not have occurred. So it's that Amy's action is not sufficient to bring that about. Yet there's a way in which we do want to say that Amy is maybe should have some accountability for this action. So we'll look at that earlier. Notice that every element in this chain is necessary for the disaster. If the board hadn't tried to implement the investors' sorry, there was a short pause there. I had to let the cat out of my office. Everybody here, their actions are necessary for the disaster. If the VP hadn't convened the committee, then Amy would not have made the recommendation. The disaster maybe would not have occurred. So in this case, nobody's sufficient and everybody's necessary, and we're not really helped in picking out somebody who is the cause of the disaster. Here's, though, a problem with the notion of a cause as a necessary condition. This is the problem of overdetermination. If two thieves both simultaneously fire their guns at somebody, then neither of them causes, according to the necessary condition of view, neither of them causes the death of the victim, because either gunshot would be enough to kill the victim. And if so, supposing this robber didn't shoot, the victim would still have died. So neither robber is a necessary condition for the death of the victim. And that seems a bit odd too. Somehow we somehow think that they are responsible or certainly accountable for their actions. Now here's a little more complicated idea. This is a problem with cause as a necessary part of a set of jointly sufficient, a nest condition, sufficient conditions. Suppose you've got a committee. There's 7 people in the committee, and the motion passes by 5 votes to 2. B, we're going to concentrate on here, votes in favor of the motion. Is B's vote a necessary, sufficient, or a necessary element of a set of sufficient conditions for the motion to pass? Well, no. Because it passed by 5 to 2, B's vote, yes vote, is not sufficient. It's not enough by itself for passing the motion, so it's not a sufficient condition. So we can cross that out. But 5 votes are jointly sufficient, but B's vote is not a sufficient condition by itself. B's vote is not necessary for passing the motion. It's still going to pass 4-3, no matter what B does. So B's vote is not a necessary element in a set of 5 votes sufficient for passing the motion. So B is not causally responsible. It's not sufficient, it's not necessary, it's not a necessary element of a set of sufficient conditions for the motion. So, and that applies to everybody. No one on the committee is causally responsible for the motion's passing. And if we think of moral accountability as involving causation, then we're going to find that causal responsibility evaporates in committees. So, and this is a problem in business ethics, because in businesses we have specialization and the division of labor, we have long causal chains, and we have a lot of committee decisions. And how are we going to assign moral accountability? How are we going to, first of all, figure out causal responsibility in business decisions, and how are we going to find, to make decisions about moral accountability? Causal responsibility is a scientific concept. It's a factual judgment, and it is difficult. And we're going to have to maybe go a little further than causal responsibility in our investigation of the moral notion of accountability. Okay, little question, just so that you see if you've got some of these ideas. Which of the following is the best example of a sufficient condition? So pause the video for a moment and we'll look through the possible answers. All right, this set of answers is the same as the ones I think we were looking at earlier. We're looking for a sufficient condition. Where do we have a condition that is sufficient and enough for the outcome? But for George's actions, his business rival would not have gone bankrupt. But for is a necessary. George's action is required for the business rival to have gone bankrupt. So this is not the answer. It's not. We're looking for something that's enough. If George carries out his plan perfectly, then his business rival will go bankrupt. Here we have George's action being enough. Here, it's enough that if George carries out his plan perfectly, then the business rival will go bankrupt. So this is certainly a possibility C. So let's look through the others before we commit. George's perfectly executed plan was unfair. Well, this is it's a moral judgment, but it's got nothing to do with causation here. So that's not one. And George carefully planned the bankruptcy of his business rival and executed the plan successfully. Well, that's sort of causal, but it doesn't really tell us, and it could be sufficient, but George's planning could be, and actions could be sufficient for the bankruptcy, but there's not enough. It's certainly not the best answer. It's not enough in here to tell us what's going on. Here's a case where George carrying out his plan perfectly is sufficient to produce the bankruptcy, and that's our best answer here. All right, so we'll try and go a little further than causal responsibility in the next segment, and I will see you very soon.